Good morning and welcome to the fourth episode of Chip Chat. Joining me today is Grant from the YouTube channel OvertheEdge. Now, Grant was the third member of the Average Gamer podcast, which we used to do with Sully from Gamecast. So I've spoken to Grant many times before, but I wanted to have him on today to talk about his channel, how he got into YouTube, and also his gaming history. We'll also be delving into some of the more serious aspects of gaming, such as gaming addiction, how games can be used to alleviate illnesses such as depression, and then moving on to a short discussion about free speech, specifically as it pertains to gaming and YouTube. So, okay, Grant, tell me all about your channel and how you got started and where you'll be going with it moving forward.
Okay, well, thanks for having me on the podcast, Joe. Yeah, my channel started in May of 2016. I did have a channel before that, which was under my own name, but it was a little bit too experimental. I was trying to find kind of a groove of what I wanted to do, but I settled on having my own gaming channel because that's really where my interests lie. So I started in May 2016, and basically the reason I started the channel is a few reasons, but mainly it was because I had some sort of free time. I'd gone through a sort of separation, and sort of my personal life was in a bit upheaval, and I needed a kind of something that was grounding, that would help me sort of be creative and it was an outlet for one of my interests, which I've kind of had throughout my life. So gaming's really been something that's been like a constant for me throughout my life. So I felt that because I was sort of rediscovering my love for gaming, because I'd been out of the gaming scene for a number of years and I hadn't done or played any video games. So the channel was a way of helping me sort of get back in touch with my love for video games. And also I wanted to look at sort of the other side of video games, so things that aren't normally covered by traditional YouTube channels. So, I might look at sort of a game's mechanics or story or narrative a little bit more in depth, and also I cover things like how video games can be therapeutic or can help people who are suffering from maybe some mental health issues like depression and anxiety. I have a series on my channel that looks at that. But yeah, I try and look at aspects of video games that are a little bit different from the norm, I guess you would say. So yeah, that's pretty much how I would summarize it anyway.
Yeah, and if anyone's interested in looking at games in that way, then I do suggest going and having a look at Grant's channel, because he does do that series, as he's mentioned, that looks at games as a form of therapy, if you like, to help you get through certain aspects of things like mental illness, things like depression. And it's a really interesting series because not a lot of people cover that kind of thing, as Grant's already alluded to. But moving on from your channel, what actually got you into gaming in the first place? What's your first experiences of games?
Well, my my very first experience of playing a video game would probably be I'm showing my age now, but back in the 70s, actually, I used to. I think on Saturday mornings I had this. I used to go and see my grandparents, and we'd go and sometimes watch a movie. And my local cinema had like video game cabinets in the hallway, because that was they were kind of everywhere in the 70s. You'd find them in like fish and chip shops, and
you'd go and get a pizza. And
exactly, and there'd be like a cabinet there. But there was a Space Invaders cabinet in my local cinema, and I was watching someone play it, and I was just fascinated by it. The noise. I mean, you could that classic noise of like the aliens coming down from the Space Invaders cabinet.
I can hear it now.
Yeah, I know. It's just so well known, and it's kind of synonymous with early video games, and like. And I played, I think it was like a 10p or something to play it. And I was just hooked from that point on. I loved video games. To me, they just sort of made sense. I mean, I didn't know where they came from, but, as a kid, you just kind of, when you find something that you like, it's like this magical experience sometimes. And
And the amazing thing about those early games as well was, sorry to interrupt,
That's all right.
but was how simple they were. And you talk about the sound. That sound was nothing like the sound you get on games today. I mean, I put a tweet up the other day about the sound in Hellblade and how amazing it is. Yeah. The sound back then was very, very simple, but sometimes simple is best because, as we've both said, we can still hear those sounds now,
Yeah, you can. I mean, partly that's because they were kind of limited to what they could do, but also they were actually quite creative in creating a sort of atmospheric sound, that I guess, with Space Invaders, we're trying to sort of create this sort of semi-sense of dread as the invaders got faster, as they got towards the bottom, it'd be a sense of panic induced in the player, and I liked the video games. I mean, they did seem to me quite sort of like it was like otherworldly, and for the first sort of, I think from that point onwards, I remember going on holiday with my parents to Spain and places like that. And we'd obviously book into a hotel, and the hotels we would go to would have like 6 or 7 cabinets on like the downstairs lobby, and I'd just be on them all the time.
Yeah,
all these different like games like Defender. I remember playing.
I used to play Defender. I used to go to a club and they had Defender, and I used to play. I was awful at it, but I used to love that game.
It was really hard, actually. Defender.
Games back then were hard, weren't they? Yeah, they were relentless and unforgiving.
Yeah, then they ate my coins. It was like my parents would be going, "You spent them already?" Yeah, I have. So yeah, it was arcade cabinets probably for the up until like the early 80s, I think. And
yeah,
I think what was it? Yeah, 82. I got I think it was Christmas maybe. We got as a surprise gift because I thought we weren't getting sort of any major presents that year because my parents. They were tricky. They were just sort of saying things like, "Oh no, we haven't got the money. You can't have any big presents this year." And I believe them because it wasn't until I think it was either like Boxing Day or New Year's Day or something like that. We came downstairs and there was this Atari VCS set up by my dad.
Wow.
And I looked at it and thought, "Whoa, it's a games console." Well, I didn't know it was called that at the time, but it was the classic Atari with the wooden. It's on the wooden panels.
Yeah, I remember playing that, although I never actually owned one. But I think my cousin had one. I used to play it around his.
So yeah, we had this game called Combat with it, which it's just, if you look at it, I can't believe we put up with it at the time. It's got to be one of the slowest games ever. You have these 2 tanks at either side of a maze, and they have to meet in the middle, and it takes about half an hour. Because I found out later that the Atari VCS has 1 hertz processor. So it's like, you can imagine it, it's like, we'll get there in the end, And that wasn't exactly a classic. That didn't endear me to the console. It was games like, there were conversions of Pac-Man and Space Invaders that we had, but neither of them were very good. But as a kid, you don't mind that because if that's all you've got to play, you just play them over and over again. And
well, that was the stock in trade of home consoles back then, wasn't it? It was a recreation of the arcade cabinet games. Yeah, and they were generally not as good as what you would get in the arcades.
No, I remember Pac-Man was pretty bad. Space Invaders was a little bit better, but it wasn't anything like the arcade because, it seemed a lot easier because I remember we would just spend hours playing it and then clocking the score back to 0 again, because we were just so obsessed with it and we didn't have anything else to play. I remember we went to this game shop, computer game shops in the early 80s were sort of like this treasure trove, especially if you were a kid. And I remember there was this pile of Atari VCS games in a basket because that was just around the time the industry was starting to crash. And I think my parents must have got the console quite cheap. And one of the games in the basket was E.T.
Oh, God.
And I said to my mum, "Oh, it's based on the film." I was like, I didn't know any better at the time. I said, "Can we get it?" And she was like, "Oh, it's $4.99, which at the time was like not very much, but seemed a lot. I remember getting it home. I started playing it, and E.T.'s infamous. On like the second screen, he walks into this pit and he can't get out again. And
there's actually a video about this game, isn't there? They made a whole
I started crying because of how bad the game was. I literally couldn't. I had to turn the console off because when she fall in the pit, you can't do anything. It's like the whole game was programmed in like 4 weeks or something.
Yeah,
and it's terrible.
the person who programmed it, they did another game. I'm trying to remember. Yar's Revenge. Were they the guy who did Yar's Revenge? And they were
possibly. But that was good.
And yeah, exactly. And they had a bit of a rep. So they went to do this game and they basically didn't have the time and it was rushed out. And you know, it just sounds familiar, doesn't it? We get that these days as well. Yeah, it's a really interesting story. And it's become infamous. And they did that film about trying to find the copies of it that were in the refuse site, weren't there? In America somewhere.
Yeah, because nobody was sure whether that was urban myth, whether they actually buried them in the desert, and it showed that they did. You know, they had so many unsold copies because the game was just terrible. That they buried a load of them in the desert. It's worth seeing actually. It's on Netflix, I think. Yeah,
I've seen it. Yeah, it's a very interesting documentary. And all these people getting really excited. There's loads of people went along to see if they'd actually find anything. And
yeah, they did. Yeah, that's right. Avid collectors. Yeah.
So after that, you went from, because I as I say, I played it, and I remember playing a console. This would have been early 80s as well. My brother-in-law, I don't know where he got it from, whether he got it secondhand or what, but he got some console, and I think that was an Atari, but it wasn't a 2600. Certainly not one of the early versions of it.
It might have been the 7800, which was like the later one. They tried to sort of. I don't know what you would call it, but Atari was sort of hemorrhaging money, and they tried a sort of last gasp attempt to stop, things going completely pear-shaped. But I think it was a bit too late because, the video game industry sort of crashed, didn't it, around?
Yeah, although not so much in this
maybe?
country as the States, because obviously in this country there was the sort of personal PC explosion, wasn't there? And we had the likes of the Commodore 64. Before that, you had the ZX81 and then the Spectrum.
Yeah, that was interesting because it was after that. I mean, that was my experience. Is we quickly got bored of the Atari. It got shoved in a cupboard, I think, after a while because you just sort of. Your taste sort of changed. I mean, you're a kid, so. And I think I became interested in home computers, like you say. There was a bigger home computer scene in the UK because you had obviously the 8-bit computers. Do
you remember US Gold? Sorry, I interrupted him.
No, I do. They made some great 8-bit games, didn't they?
Yeah, the guy basically bought up a load of stuff. He would buy things in from the States and then repackage it US Gold and then sell them. And it was basically a cottage industry. He sold it. It was a small outfit, and I think they talk about that in. There's another really good documentary, and I think that's on Netflix as well, and that's called From Bedrooms to Billions.
Yeah, I've seen it. Is that based on Imagine an Ocean software? Or or it covers the UK gaming scene, doesn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's another one that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't actually get. I mean, I badgered my parents for one of those computers. I wanted a Commodore 64, but it was like, no, you can't have it. It's like we haven't got the money. And we did get a computer though. So I went from a console, and I think around the mid 80s, sort of 85ish, my dad got us an Acorn Electron. So I was like,
oh blimey, yeah.
It was like the poor man's BBC Micro, whatever.
Yeah, we had those at school.
Yeah, it actually wasn't that bad. It was actually a decent computer, but of course, it wasn't quite as good as sort of like other machines at the time. But I mean, I loved playing like text adventures, graphic adventures, and whatever else, bad arcade ports. Because I think the BBC and the Acorn had their own version of arcade games, but they just renamed them.
Yeah, so and then obviously famously there was Elite, wasn't there?
Elite I bought for the Acorn Electron, and that was one of the first games that showed me what video games could do. In terms of like creating, because you still had to use your imagination, but the fact that it felt like you were in space, it was one of the first games to make you feel that, I think. So,
yeah, in terms of graphically compared to what we get today, it was very, very simplistic, but the concepts and the ideas in it were amazing.
Oh, it was incredible. The fact that they managed to fit so much into the Electron had 32K of RAM. It's like BBC was the same. It's just that BBC had, I think it had this extra graphical mode. So whereas the Electron version of Elite had see-through planets, the BBC Micro actually could fill them in, although it wasn't really, there wasn't like a huge gamut of colours or anything like that.
Yeah, it was all lines, wasn't it, basically? Yeah.
So yeah, I went through a succession of like home computers. I remember buying myself, saving up for, I wanted an Amiga. An A5.
Oh, my mate had one of those. I never got one of those.
I wanted an A500, but I couldn't quite afford one. They were something like £500. So I ended up, not one of my best choices in life. I ended up buying an Amstrad 6128. Yeah.
You poor bastard.
And I thought, okay, this is like the top end Amstrad because it's got a disk drive, not a tape deck. But what I didn't seem to realise is that nobody actually bothered utilising, because it had 128k of RAM. That's why the 6128. So I thought, well, this has got to be better than the Amstrad 464. Obviously, loads of games companies are going to use this extra memory. Nope. They didn't bother. All you got were the same games that you played on the other Amstrad. And I think there was one software company, and this is quite significant actually. There was a company called Magnetic Scrolls, and they made very early graphic adventures. If anyone who's listening to this remembers, these games, they were sort of seminal for the time because they were very well written games for their time. There was a company called Infocom that made PC text adventures in the 80s, and they were like novels. And they were one of the first companies to actually treat video games seriously, as an art form. And Magnetic Scrolls were the same in the sense that they tried to write sort of adult games, because a lot of games were aimed at kids because, kids played computers and consoles.
Yeah, it was still really very much considered a children's pastime at that point, wasn't it?
And Magnetic Scrolls, the reason I liked their games was because they actually bothered using the Amstrad's extra memory so they could, because you could actually load pictures at the same time because it had the 128k. And they were just clever games. And I think that was one of the main reasons I bought the computer. But I realised after a while that it wasn't very good. And I think I moved on to the ST, I think.
A word processor from Amstrad, and I don't think anything they ever made was ever particularly high-end, was it?
No. I think they tried, bless them, and they were cheaper than a lot of their competitors, but they were cheaper for a reason.
Yeah. Well, the word processor I had a disk drive in it that wasn't a standard disk drive. What it was that Alan Sugar had bought up a job lot of these disks. And so he basically made the computer with these disk drives in so he could flog these disks on.
That sounds like Alan Sugar, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But it served me well. I used to write my my university essays on it, so it served me well for a few years.
Actually,
and I played chess on it as well. It had chess.
Yeah, and that Amstrad, I think it was the PCW. A friend of mine had one at college.
That's the one. Yeah.
Yeah, he used to write his essays on it, and he had. I mentioned those Infocom text adventures. They were actually on that Amstrad. They released games on it. I mean, they were one of the few companies that did. But yeah, I sort of moved up the chain of computers, really. So I went from the Amstrad to the ST, Atari ST. And interestingly enough, I went to college in sort of like the early 90s. And in our final year of college, we had to do a work experience program. And so we could pretty much choose any sort of company we'd want to work for. And I went to college in Bath in the UK. And at the time, there was this big publishing company that published
lovely
computer
city,
magazines.
by the way, in case anyone's listening and fancies going.
Beautiful city. Yeah, it's very popular tourist city. And yeah, there was this big games or computer software publishing company called Future Publishing based there. And I said I wanted to do my work experience there, and they said fine. So I went and did my work experience on ST Format magazine, which at the time was, it was pretty much the seminal ST magazine. What you got to remember, this was 93, so the ST was kind of like, it was in its last days of popularity. But they actually let me write 2 game reviews for the magazine and publish it. which I thought was pretty amazing for a work experience,
That's amazing work experience. Usually it's like, go and sweep the stuff up in the corner.
Exactly, yeah, go and stock some shelves.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
But I still got the magazine to the day, but it kind of got me interested in writing about games as well, or seeing that there was a possibility of actually making a career out of it, because I'd never considered that before,
Yeah.
So I did.
That's ideal, isn't it? If you're interested in writing stuff and you're interested in games, getting into writing about games is phenomenal.
Yeah, I mean, it was a different climate then because magazines were king. In the 90s, it was, there was a huge amount of magazines based around either video games or just computers in general. And I left college in 94, and between 95 and 97 I freelanced for Future Publishing on the number of magazines, PC Gamer, PC Format, and I just had a set number of pages each month, and I got free games. I had a great time while I did it, and because it allowed me to kind of combine two things I loved, which was writing and video games.
Yeah.
So
I
sounds
like the holy grail to me.
Yeah, and around that time I got my first PC, a Pentium, I think it was. It was mid 90s.
Yeah, that would have been me as well. That's when I got my first PC. So our histories are quite in line.
Yeah, I mean, I played consoles at college. Because I'd never really been into consoles, seen a console, but I knew people that had either the Mega Drive or Genesis, if you're American, and the SNES. So, I played both of those, or got introduced to those at college, and I like them. I must admit, my friend of mine had the SNES, and there was a group of us who shared a house in Bath, and we played a lot of SNES games like Mario Kart. Constantly playing Mario Kart. We'd go to the pub and come back and play Mario Kart.
We used to do that.
Yeah,
we used to go back and play. Like, this was the Mega Drive. We were more. It was the people I knew were more Mega Drive people. And we used to go back and play Sonic, and there was golf games as well. I used to play a lot of golf games. Like, you sit around playing golf. The what was it? Lynx was on the PC, but it was PGA Golf.
Yeah. Oh, PGA Golf. What was the one? There was one on PC that I played, which I think graphically was quite impressive for the time. It might have been PGA Tour, actually.
It may well have been. Yeah, I know Lynx was a great game. I mean, that was actually quite well put together at the time. But I remember we used to play PGA on the Mega Drive. That was the one we used to go around and get completely drunk and
It's interesting you chose a golf game.
yeah.
So not FIFA tournaments or something. But.
No, it's just weird actually. I'm surprised we never did, because I used to love FIFA, but yeah, it was we always seemed to play golf. I think it's because we were so drunk we couldn't really play FIFA.
Yeah, well, you swinging the club's a bit of a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh Christ, so how many shots did it take to get in the hole? People used to sort of go out and make food while they were waiting for you to try and get your shot in. It was embarrassing.
Yeah. So I mean that. So console wise, it's a strange one. I mean, I had the original PlayStation. And that would have been around... Actually, the first time I saw a PlayStation is an interesting story. When I left college, I applied for a job for a company called Microprose. They don't exist anymore. But
I remember those.
Microprose were, I think they were called Spectrum Holobyte in the US, or they had like a branch of the company. But what they did PC strategy games. And they were based just outside Bristol. And I applied for a job writing software manual or games manuals for them.
Oh, crikey.
Yeah, and it was interesting because I thought, I don't stand a chance here. This is like... I got an interview, and the guy told me at the interview, he said, we had over 250 applications for this job. And I was like, I got no experience, and I got an interview. I was quite pleased. But, I mean, I didn't get the job, but one of the cool things was they had this sort of campus at Microprose. It was a bit like a college campus. It was a big place, and I saw these people playing a Japanese import PlayStation, and they were playing this. I think it was Toshinden or Battle. It was like a fighting game, And this was 94. This was before anyone had even seen a PlayStation. I was like, is that a PlayStation? The only reason I knew what it was because of Edge magazine. Always talking about it. But I was intrigued by the fact that there was a CD-based gaming console coming out, because obviously it had been cartridge up to that point.
Yeah.
And the other cool thing about that interview, I mean, as I was leaving, the guy just turned around to me and said, "Oh, do you want some games?" I was like, "Yeah, cool." And he gave me about basically their whole catalogue of games shrink wrapped in the boxes. He's like, "There you go, one of each." And I was like, there were games like XCOM, I think they published. I didn't have a PC, but I lived with a friend of mine who had just built himself quite a decent PC, and it was one of the first to have a CD-ROM drive. And so we were sitting around playing these fantastic games that I just got for free.
Amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah, I was pretty pleased with that. And yeah, so games were always around. I mean, they were always part of kind of what I was interested in. Obviously not just as being a journalist at the time or freelancer, but I sort of went in and out of games in terms of my interest. But I've always had a console or a gaming PC. I think there's only one period where I didn't. That was between like 2007 and like 2013 maybe, and that was because I played a lot of MMOs prior to that, and I got a bit burnt out with gaming, so I took a break really, just for a bit.
I was gonna ask you about that, because we've discussed this, briefly before, and what actually happened there? Can you go into a little bit more detail about that?
Sure. It's so what happened was, everybody remembers World of Warcraft. It's kind of it was one of those moments in gaming that were kind of like a watershed moment, I guess. So when World of Warcraft came out, I didn't play it when it first came out, because I was playing another online game called Final Fantasy XI, which was an MMO that was loosely based around EverQuest, which was this really hardcore MMO from like the late 90s.
My mate tried to get me into that.
Yeah, you escaped. You were lucky. I mean, you're talking about a game where it was the norm in EverQuest to actually camp 24 real life hours to wait for a creature to spawn, so you might get a chance at getting some loot from it. I mean, they used to do shifts, some of these people, where they do 8-hour shifts sat in front of their computer waiting for... I mean, it's unbelievable when you think about it now. But no, Final Fantasy XI wasn't quite as bad as that, but it was nearly as bad. And
just sorry to interrupt, but just as an aside, do you remember I put that picture up on Twitter the other day of those games I found?
Yeah,
that box of PC games. I think that's got a copy of EverQuest in the box. I think there's actually a copy there that my mate gave me, and I never played it.
Interestingly enough, a friend of mine that I'd worked with around the time of EverQuest, he gave me a copy of the game because he wanted me to get into it with him, because I think he needed people to play with, and I just refused, because I'd heard about how bad it was and how demanding it was. But it didn't stop me playing both Final Fantasy XI and World of Warcraft obsessively. I mean, I wasn't going through a particularly good time in my life around sort of like 2004-05, and so for the next 2 years, all I did was really play both of those two games, and I would be playing for 12 hours a day sometimes.
Yeah.
And I had this, I mean, I've spoken about it in a video. I've got a video about gaming addiction on my channel, and what I realised one day when I was playing, I think I was playing Final Fantasy XI, and a lot of what the game was, if you wanted to level up, basically the players in the game found the most efficient way possible to level up, and it was to stand in one place. Playing all songs. And they... Shit, sorry, my phone just decided to do something weird. So what I found is we used to stand in the same place fighting the same monsters in the game just to level up, and I just stood there one day and I thought, why am I doing this? This is stupid. It's absolutely pointless. It's not enjoyable. I wasn't having any fun doing it. I was doing it because that's what everybody else did in the game.
Yeah.
And I just stopped. I stopped playing.
That is kind of addiction as opposed to a pastime.
It was addiction because, I mean, yeah, I was addicted to the game. But to be fair, it was mostly... The game itself wasn't very good. I mean, Final Fantasy XI was... oh god, it was so punishing. It used to take experience points off you if you died, and you could de-level actually, because it was that harsh. I played for a long time because we had a really close community of people that I actually got to become friends with in real life. We'd have meetups quite regularly as well. And the same.
So that's a positive side to it.
So there's a positive side to it, but I was playing the game obsessively, and I realised I was. And also, as a result of playing for like the amount of hours that I did, I developed a really bad RSI in my right hand.
I remember you telling me about this, yeah.
So I kind of there was two things. I kind of had to stop playing the game, but I also had, because of the RSI, I really had to stop gaming full stop, because it wasn't going to, I was told by the doctor it was not going to get any better, because my job at the time was as a web developer, so I was using a computer all day anyway.
Yeah.
And then coming home and playing a game for like 6 or 7 hours in the evening. There's like,
God, it must have been killing your eyes as well as your hands.
It was killing my eyes. It's actually affecting my mental health as well. To be clear here, I was not doing myself any favours. And then I met what is currently my ex-girlfriend. I met her around 2008, and she wasn't a fan of gaming. I was sort of thinking I need to stop, and I just stopped gaming for 5 years. And it wasn't until in 2013 where I thought, I was sort of, actually no, it was a bit late now. It's probably 2014. So I was kind of single again, and I thought, I got my loose end. I bought myself a PlayStation 3 and a copy of The Last of Us. And by that point,
the rest is history.
Yeah, by that point, I wasn't suffering from RSI because I hadn't been doing any gaming really for about 5 years. I think I played the odd game with my stepson. We played a bit of Batman or Just Cause or something like that, but it was only for like an hour or so every so often,
Yeah.
So it wouldn't.
So it just became something a bit of a backdrop to everyday life.
But I wasn't enjoying it. I always gamed because it was fun to me, and the moment it stops becoming fun, it's not good, because it's something I've always liked enjoying. And what I found was, when I got back into it, I mean, what a first game to play. The Last of Us was
it's just like mind-boggling.
I remember sitting down and playing The Last of Us. I didn't know anything about the game, only that it was good. Someone had told me it's worth playing. I thought, okay. So I sat and I played the first hour, and my jaw was on the floor. I was like, is this how games have evolved? Because it never used to be this good. It's like...
And they still aren't this good.
They still aren't. You might argue that they...
You just found the one that, you found the diamond in the rough, so to speak. You found the game, the standout game. There's lots of standout games, but there's also an awful lot of rubbish out there as well.
There's a lot. I mean, I bought a PS3 in 2014, and obviously the PS4 was out by then. But obviously the advantage is I got a lot of cheap games, because they were just selling off the PS3 games quite cheap. But there was obviously this big back catalogue of games I could explore as well. Although I do remember going into a game shop and saying, to the guy, I finished The Last of Us on PS3. I'm just thinking, is there anything as good as that? And they just started laughing. No, basically. And I just thought, okay, well, I still managed to play stuff like the Uncharted series, which I'd never played. And a friend of mine recommended it. He said, you'll really like Uncharted. I said, okay.
Yeah, and they are good games. I wouldn't put them up there quite as high as The Last of Us, but they are great. And 4 especially. I've only really played through 1. I'm not even sure I finished it. I've not played 2, and I've heard 2's supposed to be the best one of the lot. A lot
2
of
is,
say.
I would say 2 is the most cinematic one in a way, because there's a lot of really good set pieces in 2, which... Yeah, 2 is probably... I'm not sure if I would say it was the best, because I think 4 is the best now. But I was quite surprised by 3 and how good that was, because I didn't expect that to be as good. That's also good. It's just shorter than the others. 3 is only about 8 to 10 hours maybe.
Yeah, it's my sort of speed then.
and it has a lot of cutscenes compared to the other games, but... it's Naughty Dog. They're good at storytelling, aren't they? So
they are, yeah. They're the best in the business, to be honest.
Yeah.
But going back to what you were saying about the period when you were playing, not playing EverQuest, but you were playing the MMO games.
Yeah.
This is something that I think is really interesting, actually, because Jim Sterling did a video this week, and he talks about the way in which, a lot of games have been kind of MMO'd, and that this sustainable model of games where you keep people playing, and he talks about it trying to tap into the sort of addictive nature of the gamer.
Yes,
and that interests me, because I think that it looks now. I never was a great one for MMOs. As I say, I've got a friend of mine who loves MMOs. They're his favourite type of game.
Yeah.
He doesn't really get to play them these days because he hasn't got the time. Nice. But they do suck you in, and they do keep you playing. And it seems that if you look at the open world model and the games as service model, it seems to be much more that kind of approach. And it's almost like that idea has moved it much more into the kind of mainstream of gaming. Not to say that MMOs weren't mainstream, but they did occupy a particular niche in some respects.
Yeah, I think.
But I just wondered how you think that might, play into this thing of addiction, and we already know that the likes of EA, Activision, and others are looking into trying to keep people playing.
Yeah.
And I just wondered what you make of that.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. What I think happened was that people saw the phenomenal success of a game like World of Warcraft, which I think at its peak, I might have got the figures wrong here, but they had at least 12 million people playing, and probably more. But what happened was, as World of Warcraft sort of declined in popularity, what games companies did was, you're absolutely right, they looked at the aspects of MMOs that made them addictive. And it's pretty much this carrot on a stick gameplay, as I call it. So you're always giving the player an incentive to keep playing by offering him something that's just in the distance. So it's like working towards a reward each time. So what games companies did was they took the MMO model and they started applying it to like single player games. So basically you'd get what were called single player offline MMOs. So if you think of games like Skyrim, it's a good example. There's the Dragon Quest series. I played Dragon Quest Inquisition. That's effectively an MMO. It's just a single player MMO because you're doing all the same things you would in an MMO. And you're absolutely right. What games companies are doing is they've looked at how MMOs entice people, and they've started applying these principles more and more to single player games at first, but also later on, if you think of a game like Destiny, that's an MMO. That's really, it's just a sci-fi MMO. I guess you call it an MMO FPS, but it has all those sort of aspects of an MMO. So you've got loot boxes, or as we are constantly reminded of loot boxes in gaming, just generally because they're everywhere. And what games companies are doing is they're realizing how, instead of using this traditional subscription model, which is what you would have used with a game like WoW, so you pay your £10 a month on top of the cost of the game, they're thinking, well, how can we get the player to keep paying once they've bought the game? We can't use the subscription model anymore because it's not quite an MMO that we're offering them. But what they're doing is they're kind of like repackaging the MMO for the kind of contemporary gaming world, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite cynical in a lot of ways. I think, it's good we've got people like Jim Sterling just sort of kind of shining a light on this, because there are very insidious practices going on where games companies are very much tapping into the addictive nature of both gaming, but also the type of player who's likely to fall for that as well. So there is a certain amount of exploitation going on. It used to make me laugh. Final Fantasy XI, okay, when you loaded the game up, it used to have this warning screen. It said, I can't remember the exact wording, but it was something like, this gaming world can be a very enthralling place to spend time in, but don't forget your family, friends, and work. And it's like, yeah, okay. So on the one hand, you're pretending to be conscientious and saying to players, don't play for a long time, but you're also creating a game which specifically requires them to spend hours on end in order to achieve anything in game.
Yeah.
And what you're seeing that replicated in games like Destiny, where players know in order to get the better drops, they have to spend hours and hours just grinding, in order to get it. And then, of course, that's where the loot box system comes in, because you've got games companies offering them a shortcut.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think it's, without swearing, what I think of the practice is it's exploitation.
It's this incredibly exploitative,
Yeah.
and I thought this for a while, and I actually posted on Jim Sterling's latest video and said, thanks for saying this. This is something I felt for a while, and he actually makes the point that he doesn't think it's sustainable because they're all going after the same market.
Yeah.
And when you've got these games where people are expected to put in large amounts of time in order to progress through the game, there's only so many hours in the day.
Yeah.
And, as alluded to in the Final Fantasy game, you don't forget to spend time with your family and do your job and all the rest of it.
Yeah, exactly.
But if every game, or at least a large number of games, and increasingly a lot of the larger developers and larger publishers seem to be wanting to go down this route, if they're all going down this route,
yeah,
well, there's going to be a lot of casualties in that market because, and I'm not talking about the gamer here, I'm talking about the games. This is what Jim Sterling's saying, that not every game can have that, have an audience because there simply aren't enough gamers out there, and there's not enough time for everybody to spend so much time on so many games with that model.
Yeah, because what they don't seem to have realised is, MMOs sort of they caught a wave, they caught a trend of popularity, which it was just sort of a case of good timing on, if you look at companies like Blizzard, yeah, they managed to in some ways get lucky with World of Warcraft. But what the problem is gaming. And the average age of a gamer has increased, and as a result of that, the gamers that are playing games on average are, say, in their 30s or in their mid-30s.
Yeah,
they just don't have the time anymore to play games for 12 to 14 hours a day like they used to in the early 2000s.
The conversations we constantly are having, on this and over on Discord and with Clay and with Sully and with all the other guys. We're increasingly looking at things like the indie scene.
Yeah.
Because as you get older and you've got other responsibilities like a job, like a family, like cleaning the house and all the rest of it, boring as those things are, they need to be done.
Exactly, yeah.
There's a limited amount of time that you have to spend on games. As much as we love playing games, I can't sink 6, 7, 8 hours a day into a game, much as even, I might like to at times.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just not doable.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, the fact is, I used to do that, and I'm conscious of the fact that I won't do that again, because the end result of it was I stopped enjoying gaming, because I think when you put that amount of hours into a game, I think an inevitable result is that you will lose the enjoyability factor. Because
absolutely,
yeah, this is just based obviously on my personal experience, and I find now that because I deliberately restrict the amount of gaming I do in a day, hours-wise, I could game more, but I don't. And the reason I don't is because I know I won't enjoy it as much. Because it's more important for me to get a quality amount of time gaming rather than having a huge amount of quantity time. If you see.
Exactly right. Quality over quantity.
Yeah.
And I look back to something I read some years ago now about if you're going out, and I used to do this, and you used to do this, I'm pretty certain. You're in your 20s and you're going out regularly, sometimes every night in a week. Down a pub, boozing it up, and you get to a point where you think, I can't do this any longer.
Yeah.
One, physically I can't do it any longer, but I'm bored with it. I can't keep doing it.
Yeah.
The problem is, this is what happens with these kind of games, is that the most people will reach a point where they get jaded with it and they can't sustain it, and they don't want to sustain it.
No.
But there will be those people where that are susceptible to those kind of things that will keep going. And when it's drink,
Yeah.
And when it's drugs and stuff, they're the people, eventually they will end up being alcoholics or they will be addicts.
Yeah, they will.
But the worrying thing here is, it seems to me that the likes of EA, I don't want to single out EA because other companies are doing it, but like the likes of a lot of these AAA businesses now, they seem to be actually targeting those individuals. And that's really worrying.
That is worrying. Yeah, they're exploiting an aspect or a defect in someone's personality, like you say, that makes them more susceptible to becoming obsessed or gaming compulsively. So when we talk about addiction, we talk about the fact that it's an obsession and a compulsion. So you've got those two elements. And what games companies are doing, not all of them obviously, but you've mentioned EA, and there are other companies that are just as bad. They knowing full well that there are people with this sort of, I don't want to call it weakness. It's not a weakness. It's just an aspect of someone's. It's a lot
more common for a start than a lot of people would.
Yeah, exactly. It's an aspect of someone's character which makes them more vulnerable. Excuse me, to addiction. And we just had recently, didn't we? Early in the year, the World Health Organization have decided to recognise gaming addiction as a mental health condition for the first time.
Yeah.
So this is an issue, and I did a video on it, and I come down on I come down on sort of a complex side of this argument, because I've been addicted to both gaming and I've had other addictions in my life as well. So I know about addiction. It's damaging, but I think what you've got to be careful of is, because you've got an organisation like the WHO saying this is a proper condition. We don't want to be. We need to be careful not to label people as having a gaming addiction problem when they might not necessarily have one.
Yeah.
Because it's a complex issue, but that's not to say that there are a lot of people that game problematically, because there are a hell of a lot of people that game problematically, I think. And otherwise we wouldn't be having this discussion about gaming addiction, and we wouldn't be labelling it. We wouldn't have a big organisation like that saying that this is a problem. It is obviously a problem, but I think what it is sometimes by highlighting gaming addiction as an issue, you might get people think that they've got an issue when they don't. So there's two sides of the argument. We've got to support those that do, but we also, as an industry, and the publishers, need to be a hell of a lot more responsible in the way that they both design games, and put elements into games which could cause people to, basically become addicted to an element within the game. So if you think of FIFA's loot boxes, they're the packs, you got people spending thousands of pounds on these things.
Yeah, and you're increasingly hearing stories now from people, and it does seem, as you've just suggested, that there's an awful lot of people out there with these issues that we haven't really heard about before.
No.
I think you're right, though. I do think that we need to make sure we have a balance, because, like with alcohol, and various other things, most people will game and it will be fine.
Yeah.
But when you have obvious targeting, that's when it's an issue. And I don't know about you, but I'm looking at this and I'm thinking that we're heading very rapidly towards a situation where governments and legal representatives, if you like, for want of a better way of putting it, are starting to look at these things. And if we're not careful, we're going to have some, pretty stringent legislation come to bear on gaming. And when you look at some of the other things that are going on with, Donald Trump blaming games for the shooting that happened recently in the States and stuff like that, we need to be really, really careful about, letting governments get their hands on these things too much. Because, you a bit like, you get with the gaming industry itself, you give them an inch and they'll take a mile. So, we ideally what we want is for the gaming industry to to stand up and take some bloody responsibility. But the problem is, was it the body in America, the ESPA, is it? Or,
ESRB? Who talking about?
ESRB, that's it. The ESRB in America, they were formed by the industry. And if you look at them, they're toothless and they don't really do a great deal.
No, they're kind of, I don't know. I mean, they're sort of like a token body, aren't they? I mean, I think they came about as a result of basically the government saying, well, either sort yourselves out as an industry or we'll do it for you. So it was
exactly, that's exactly what happened.
But what a surprise! Gaming becomes an easy target after a tragedy, and I mean, I don't think we'll get any legislation that will arise from this. But you're absolutely right in the sense that gaming does need to take responsibility for itself, and that sort of that sort of takes the form of several aspects of what we've just been talking about. They need to be not producing and designing elements within games that are gonna sort of encourage addictive behaviour or compulsive gaming behaviour, because it's become almost too much of a norm to have elements within games that are encouraging either extra spending or attachment to the game, so you play for longer amounts of time. So the gaming as an industry needs to take responsibility, and I don't think they've been doing that really, because it's the danger is that things like loot crates will become just accepted. And I know that people made a stand against Battlefront 2, which was good, but the industry will keep pushing to see what they can get away with.
Yeah, and it is starting to become the norm. I mean, when you make videos about stuff like this, which I've done, you will get people coming on increasingly defending it.
Yeah,
and telling you to stop moaning about it. And you have to wonder, there was a thing on the radio that they were talking about gambling addiction a few weeks ago. And there was a person on there they were talking to who was obviously addicted to gambling, but had no awareness of the fact that they were addicted to gambling.
Yeah, which is common.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is what worries me is you increasingly see people defending this, and you just wonder how much money are they actually spending on these things. And
see, the problem is, isn't it, that because publishers haven't wanted to increase the price of games, they've just thought, well, how else can we get people to spend more money on games? And one of the ways that they've chosen is to put an addictive gambling element within the game. I mean, even a game like Overwatch, which I've defended because it only has cosmetic micro transactions, it has cosmetic items that you can buy. But the fact is, because that's become normalized, and everyone accepts that Overwatch has done it in a kind of bit more of a tasteful way, I know a lot of people who play Overwatch, and I know a lot of people that have spent money on those loot crates, even though you can earn them in game just by playing the game, because there will always be a certain amount of people that want to do that, because it's part of their nature, it's part of their character. So you've got to make sure that you don't make it this insidious part of a game where it's sort of like you can only open loot crates. You can only progress in the game if you open loot crates, for instance. Because we've had that discussion before, haven't we? That could become an issue if people don't make a stand against it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this also goes back to something we were talking about just before we started recording, and the fact that you hear people talking from the industry talking about this being choice and offering players more options and stuff within game. And we were talking about, if you look back, going back to we were talking about your gaming history earlier.
Yeah.
If you look back at the time when we were playing games like Doom, those games, I said to you before, didn't I? Those games were the games that just kept giving, because they were literally endless, and they weren't endless just because there were more maps and stuff put out by the people publishing the game, they were also open-ended so that the player themselves could create stuff for the game. You could change virtually everything in that game. You could make maps for it. Christ, people even made complete re-story, they completely told new stories and came up with complete new games based on that engine, if you like.
Yeah, there was, I mean, the Doom engine obviously inspired a lot of other games, like you say. And I mean, the early days of gaming, sort of as I think we discussed, up until probably the 2000s, when it became more and more big business, it was like the Wild West. It's a lot like the early days of the internet. Nobody was really interested in making as much money as possible. They were doing it. Games like Doom were made because people like John Romero and, John Carmack.
Yeah.
They did it because they loved games. I mean, they weren't expecting it to become a massive commercial success. I mean, obviously, yeah, that was a reason for doing it as much as anything. But those guys wanted to give something back, and the whole, you had things like shareware, which, like you say, was about giving the player something for free. So maybe buy the full game, but there wasn't this. It wasn't like this in-your-face kind of the way they do it now. It's like it was a lot different. The kind of culture, the culture around gaming was very different then.
And the thing is, they did make money.
And they did, absolutely, because
they made bucket loads of money.
I mean, Doom, it was hugely successful, and Doom 2 as well.
So you can make money. That we're not saying gaming publishers and gaming developers can't make money.
No,
absolutely.
Not at all.
It couldn't be further from the point. We want them to make money because we want to invest some of that money in new games, for crying out loud.
Yeah, I mean,
if they're not making money, they're not making more games. Simple as that.
Yeah,
but it's how they make the money that's important.
Exactly right. I mean, you see that. I mean, you talked about games as a service. Yeah, we're increasingly getting an emphasis, aren't we, on games as a service and games and multiplayer games as being the most important, areas of gaming, because for a lot of companies, that's where they make their money. Yeah. Sure, fine. But also look at the flip side of it. We're increasingly being told by certain people in the industry that single player games are dying out. And it's just rubbish, because if you look at a game like Horizon, it's a new IP. It's sold nearly 8 million copies. It's like, well,
yeah, and it's a great game. And there's so many great single player games out there still, and most gamers I know want both. You do get the hardcore who only want to play online games.
Yeah,
but most of us, we want to play a few online games, we want to play some single player games, we want to play some platformers, some shooters, some puzzle games, whatever it might be. We want to dip in and try lots of different things, and sometimes we'll like a game, sometimes we won't, and that a lot of the time comes down to personal taste. But you don't want one size fits all approach to gameplay.
No, we don't.
And it seems to me at the moment that certainly in the AAA industry, it's being stifled by this kind of myopic approach to let's make money, and this is the best way of making money.
Yeah, I mean,
and unfortunately, I don't know if that's going to change anytime soon.
I don't know either, and no one's denying that gaming is a business. It's a big business. It's massive. You have to make money. Yeah, of course you do, but we need variety, and we don't want a case where companies become so risk averse that you get this increasing homogenization where all the games that are released are just clones of each other, because that is a danger of what could happen if gamers don't demand enough variety or buy, a kind of, like you say, a range of games. Maybe you and I aren't typical, because we will buy, like you say, single player games, we'll buy some multiplayer, we'll dip in and out of that, and we'll also buy indie games, for instance. So it benefits everyone who's a gamer to have as much choice as possible, but that might not always be the case if gaming is allowed to kind of progress along this sort of increasingly narrow kind of tunnel where choice becomes just insignificant, because that's not what makes money.
Yeah, and it's the wrong way round, it seems to me. It's rather than the customer saying we want this and then they go out and make something that will appeal to the customer. It's more that they are telling us what we want. I don't think that. I agree with Jim Sterling. I don't think that this approach to sort of one size fits all let's go after the bottom line all the time. Let's make every game open world. Let's make every game have loot boxes. I don't think that's sustainable. And I think, the backlash we saw against Battlefront 2 is probably only the beginning. And I think it will get worse before it gets better. But I think sooner or later something is going to have to give.
Yeah, I mean, gaming moves in trends. I mean, if you look at, say, between 2014 and, say, 16, there was an obsession with open world games. We had virtually every major AAA release was open world. I don't think the model is sustainable. People will get bored if you keep giving them the same thing, because even though the figures show that games like, obviously, the Call of Duty series sell incredibly well, that began to see a decline, and people started to get bored of that as well. And, so nothing is, it's not the case that Call of Duty is immune to the sort of trends or taste trends of the general public, because it isn't.
Exactly right. But just before we move on to the subject of the hairy subject of free speech, which I'd like to cover a little bit.
Yeah.
You touched on briefly a little bit earlier on about the flip side of games and how games can be used as a way of dealing with depression. And
yeah, they can.
Could you just explicate? Is that the right word? Could you just,
kind of, if you want it to be.
Could you go into that in just briefly in a little bit more detail? And because you said to me before we started that you'd been looking up this a little bit and
yeah, I mean, obviously I mentioned earlier that I've got the Games as Therapy. That's a section of my channel where I look at how video games can help. I mean, I've had my own issues with depression and anxiety, and what I found was that video games actually helped me deal with that. And the way that they helped me deal with it was, I didn't know exactly how they were helping me from, say, a scientific perspective. But interestingly enough, I did actually look up, like you say, before we started the podcast, I was interested in the science and whether there'd been any studies on how games can benefit people. I read an article on the BBC News website from a guy that was a gamer, and he suffered from depression and anxiety. And what he found was that he started playing Firewatch, actually, of all games, and he was in a state where he didn't really want to play a game because he was. His own depression and anxiety had taken such a toll that he couldn't actually pick up a regular game like a shooter and play it because he found it too much. But what he did was he started playing Firewatch, and because of the setting of the game, because it was outdoors and it was problem solving, and it had a strong effect on him, and it actually encouraged him to go and seek help for his own depression and anxiety as a result of playing the game, because the game itself touches on issues which sort of sparked him to realise the problems that he was facing himself. And I thought that was interesting that he was able to get a better perspective on that. But as a result of that, reading that story, I was sort of directed towards this article that was written by this woman called Jane McGonigal. It's on slate.com. Maybe we'll be able to link to it afterwards, but because it's worth reading.
If you give me the link, I'll put it in the description.
Yeah. And what she said was that playing video games or video game play is literally the neurological opposite of depression. And I found that quite an interesting statement. I thought, well, what does she mean by that? And the reason why she said that was because there was a study at Stanford University that was done a few years ago. It was an fMRI study where they basically looked at the games of the brains of gamers. It's a bit of a mouthful.
The games of brainers.
The games of brainers, yeah, exactly. So what they found was that when we play games, there's two regions of the brain that are hyper-stimulated when you play video games. And one of those is the region that's associated with motivation and goal orientation. Okay, so you might expect that because games actually, a lot of games cover, they work towards a goal and they motivate you to do that. So that makes a lot of sense. But the other region, which was the hippocampus, that's a region that's most associated with learning and memory. So you've got two areas of the brain that when you play video games are hyper-stimulated. And these same two regions are the ones that are chronically understimulated and even shrink over time when we're clinically depressed. So
that's interesting.
Yeah. So what she was finding was that there had been several major video game studies which have shown a correlation between people playing video games for, say, like 20 or 30 hours a week and depression. But some researchers interpreted this as evidence that video games cause depression. But that's not actually the case, because nowadays the common interpretation is that many depressed players are actually trying to self-medicate with games. As what happens is they experience a dramatic relief from their symptoms while they're actually playing video games. So therefore, the more depressed they are, the more they play, because they find that it actually helps them. So, video games can be obviously like a medicine for some people.
That's actually really interesting, because that I'm no expert on this, but that ties in with something I think Steven Pinker was saying about depression, and saying that he'd found, or not he, but researchers had found that if you're suffering with depression, if you go and do something active, if you engage in some sport, or you get engaged in something active, you get yourself out of the house, you do something, it can actually help to get you over the depression, or at least cope with the depression. And it can literally get you to a point where you can get beyond it.
Makes a lot of sense.
And so this looks like that might tie in with that kind of idea as well, that you're actually you're doing something active, you're doing something that is engaging your brain.
Absolutely right. I mean, this makes a lot of sense to me, because I found that if I got more benefit from playing certain types of games. So if I was like this study showed, if I was playing a game that was quite strongly goal orientated, or it was motivates you to actually work towards a sort of achievable goal, then I was finding I was getting relief. While I was playing a game, I wasn't thinking about my own depression. I was concentrating on playing the game. And what she also did, she did add a caveat in the article, which I think is important, because I've touched on this on other videos. What you've got to be careful of when you're playing games is it's important to try and avoid an escapist mindset, and not use games to actually block out the emotions that you're struggling to deal with, or use games to avoid confronting life issues or life situations that you're putting off dealing with. Okay, so it's important that you're using games as just a tool to deal with depression, but not as the only possible way that you cope with things, because it's like anything, I think it's dealing with a problem like depression and anxiety is multifaceted. You can't just expect to take one approach and it to solve everything for you. I mean, maybe if you also used it, say, with therapy. I mean, I've had my own personal therapy and counselling, which I found was useful alongside using things like video games. And I found that I was able to pull myself out of a slump. I mean, obviously I still get bad days and I still suffer from depression now, but I find it easier to deal with if I take, like you say, practical steps to deal with it.
Yeah.
And that's and I was interested in the science, and that actually sort of kind of confirms what I sort of expected, which was that I'm sure in the majority of people, video games will help. But as I say on my channel, you know within yourself when you're using video games as a crutch. And I think that's the difference. You've got to be able to keep a balance between the medicating aspect of playing video games and using them as escapism.
Yeah. And as we've touched on with the addictive element as well, you've got to be careful of not replacing one problem with another.
Exactly. Yes, precisely, because that is a danger with addiction. You're filling a hole with something else.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we've covered that area for now. I'd just like to move on and talk about the other subject that we mentioned at the beginning. And that's something that has come front and centre for me this last week, as you know.
Yes.
And that's to do with freedom of speech and freedom of expression.
Yeah.
And I'm going to just briefly gloss over this. I'm not going to go into a lot of details because I don't want to be attacking any individuals or going down that road. I think that's absolutely not the way to go with things like this. Mm-hmm. But I had an issue this week where I had to actually kick someone, and I did want to offer them the chance to come back in, but there's the problem is I haven't got their details, so I can't actually tell them, look, if you're prepared to calm down, you could come back. But my idea was to give him a timeout. But basically, we had a situation where there was somebody who was being a little bit relentless in my Discord channel, and I did something that I'd always swore I wouldn't do, and I actually kicked a guy. And this is almost, I'm almost pathologically against doing that.
Yeah.
And part of the reason for that, it comes as a result of my views on free speech and the idea that I think people should be allowed to speak whether you agree with them or not. I think there is an area when it becomes untenable when somebody's not actually engaging in dialogue but are only interested in monologue.
Yeah.
And I think that becomes problematical. But I do really hold with the idea of free speech.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to ask you about this because there's been a few stories over the last few years, and I'm not going to go through all of them here, but this is interesting because today is, as you told me just before we started, today is International Women's Day, which was quite interesting because I mentioned Colin Moriarty.
Yeah.
And his tweet, was it last year or the year before?
No, it was, that's a good point, actually. I think it was 2017. Yeah, it was last year.
Yeah, where he, on International Women's Day, he tweeted out, peace and quiet, a day without women.
His bad joke is what I would call it, Not very funny.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I'll be absolutely honest here, that actually made me chuckle. And I showed it to my partner, and it made her chuckle too.
Yeah, it made me, I just sniggered at it a bit, and I thought, that's a bit of a cheesy sitcom joke. And I think a lot of people that weren't pretending to be outraged over it were actually had probably the same view of it, I think.
Yeah, it was fairly innocuous. And
yeah.
From my own personal experience, and I'll keep this as brief as possible, but from my own personal experience of being a stay-at-home dad and the primary carer from a little boy, not so little now, but I've spent a lot of time at parent and child groups, especially when he was younger.
Yeah.
And the reality is that you hear a lot worse than that about men when you're at a parent and child group, and you get people coming up to you and asking you if you can cope and trying to do things that they would never do to a woman.
Yeah.
They just assume that you're completely incapable of changing a nappy or putting some milk in a bottle or
can you multitask?
Yeah, exactly.
Because you are a man after all. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Which is, as an aside, is quite interesting. The Kruger-Dunning effect, which I've mentioned to you before, suggests that people who think they're good at multitasking are usually the people who are worse at multitasking. So that's an interesting aside.
Yeah, actually, I can believe that, to be honest. Yeah.
But I just think that sometimes people get a little bit, worked up about something that is fairly innocuous, but it gets more hairy, if you like, when you get into areas where people are actually saying things that are, and I know some people think that Colin Moriarty was, saying something dodgy, but as we've just said, I don't necessarily agree with that.
Yeah.
But when you get into more dodgy areas like Simon Chalinsky being fired from, what was the name of the game? Subnautica.
Subnautica, yeah, that's right.
And some of the things he said were genuinely, dodgy.
Yeah, they were, absolutely. Yeah, I looked at them and I thought, don't agree with you there, dude, but it's a bit extreme. Yeah. Yeah,
but I mean, what do you make of, him being fired, and what do you make of the kind of, where was it? It was Reset Era, which is a website that kind of went after the guy and almost tried, well, they did. It seemingly, some people on there wanted to try and get him fired, and I wondered what you made of that.
Well, I don't like that sort of behaviour. I don't think that's reasonable. I mean, a lot of people would say, well, what he was saying wasn't reasonable. No, it probably wasn't. But what we've got to be careful of is there is a tendency, and I've noticed it within, say, the last 12 to 18 months, or social media, is there's increasingly people seem to want this kind of echo chamber of, where the same sort of views bounce off each other. And what happens is that any views that kind of stand outside of this kind of accepted norm of liberalism, and let's be honest, a lot of the views on, or the active people on social media tend to have more liberal views. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with having liberal views, because I identify as liberal myself, but
you and me both. We're both left of the line, aren't we? I would say
exactly. But what I think the problem is, if we become less and less tolerant of views that don't align with our own, what you'll get more situations like you get with Reset Era, where, I mean, it makes me wonder, why did they consider it reasonable to go after someone's livelihood in that way? Yes, he said things that weren't particularly nice and borderline racist, I guess, but the problem I have with that is that what he was doing, he wasn't inciting violence. He wasn't, he wasn't saying anything that would be like grossly offensive. It was borderline offensive, but I think,
and even if it was extremely offensive, it's was he actually saying go out and attack people?
No, he wasn't.
Was he doing it?
He wasn't saying that at all. And preventing a man from earning a living, or any person, not just a man, is just completely unreasonable as far as I'm concerned. I can't. Free speech is a very important facet to uphold, because it partly defines our democracies in the West.
Well, I actually think I said this in my video about this, that it's not free speech if you're only defending it when it's somebody saying something you agree with.
Yes, exactly right. Yeah.
Chomsky got into hot water about this when he defended I can't remember the guy's name, unfortunately, but there was a Holocaust denier who was saying some pretty dodgy, extremely dodgy stuff. And let me be absolutely clear here, and I need to make this clear in case anyone listens to this and starts going off on one before they've actually listened. Anyone with any sense, anyone who's done any reading, anyone who has the most basic understanding of history knows that the Holocaust happened and it was bloody horrendous.
Yeah.
The issue there wasn't that Chomsky was saying that what the guy said was okay. He made it very, very clear that what the guy was saying wasn't okay.
Yeah.
His point was, who gets to decide who can speak?
Yeah.
When you start going down that road, you walk into a very, very dangerous area. And it's the kind of mindset that you get from the most extreme thinkers in history. People like Stalin, people like Hitler.
Yeah.
Any dictator in history has always been the one who wanted to stop other people speaking.
Yeah, and we don't want a situation where, because of the influence of things like social media, the medium becomes some sort of social arbiter as to what you can and can't say. Because that's the last thing we want. It's like you're saying, you have to also defend, if you want to defend free speech, you have to also defend views you don't agree with. And that might be almost be a polar opposite to your views, especially actually, because
absolutely,
that's part of it. I mean, we don't have to agree with these views, but that's not the point. It's the fact that we have created a system where we allow people to speak opposing views, and we allow people to speak with a certain amount of freedom as well. But if you think about it, that's not what's happened in this case. He's had his freedom restricted by outside forces, which I have a real problem with that. I don't like what's happened. I think it's unreasonable, and I actually feel a lot of empathy for the guy, because if I was forced out of my job because of some things I'd said on social media, yes, I would have to take responsibility to a certain extent, but I think it's crossing over a line that I don't like. I don't, personally, that's my view on it, I think.
Well, I think there's several issues here. I think, one of the issues is that should people be in a situation where they're in a job and their employer gets to dictate what they can think? Because that's basically what this comes down to.
Yeah, that's true, actually.
And I know he was on social media, and I know he was talking, but we all go on social media. Now, if he was, say, somebody who was front-facing in the company, and he was saying these things, in his position within the company, then I should say that might cause him some problems.
Yeah, but that wasn't really the case here. Yeah, don't a lot of people what they do sometimes? Sorry to interrupt. On their profile,
no, that's okay.
A lot of the times and maybe they have to put this. They'll say these views don't represent those of the company or my employer, for instance. And I wonder if that's because obviously the situation's arisen in the past, but they might just be doing it to cover their own backs. Because I totally agree with you. Why should a company, unless your social media account, say you work in social media, for instance, for the company, then it would be relevant that you couldn't necessarily say certain things because you're representing the company on social media. But it's different. I think a lot of people are having to put things like my views do not necessarily represent those of the company I work for.
Which should be a given, really. Yeah. It's like when people, put in my humble opinion. Well, it's no one else's bloody opinion, is it?
Exactly. It's like, why should you have to put that? It's like, well, what else is it?
It's just we live in a world where people are, one, looking to be offended, and two, then looking to attack the object of their ire, if you like.
Yeah.
And when I was talking about this with some people online, I can't remember exactly where it was, whether it was on Discord or whether it was on Twitter or wherever it was. Somebody said to me that, free speech, and I've heard this a lot, free speech and free speech laws and all these things, which we haven't actually got in this country in the same way they have in the States. They've actually got an amendment, haven't they, relating to free speech?
We don't have a written constitution in the UK. That's the problem.
Exactly. Yeah. And Christopher Hitchens, who I'm about to mention in a minute, actually campaigned to try and have a written constitution that included freedom of speech, sort of codified into that. But the interesting thing there is that people always say, these things are to protect us against our government stopping us from having free speech. And I understand where they're coming from on that. But Christopher Hitchens said something in a video that I thought was really interesting. And I came across it just after I'd listened to people saying this.
Yeah.
And he said, the biggest threat to free speech in the current era is public opinion. That you get these groups of people who band together and will go after somebody and try and shut them up. Not because what they're saying is wrong necessarily, they believe it's wrong, but just because they don't agree with them. And it's not good enough that they can engage with them and debate with them and show their opinion up for what it is. They have to literally gag them.
Yeah.
You get the deplatforming. And when you're talking about deplatforming, you're not just talking about deplatforming of far right groups or far right speakers or extreme, Islamists and people like this.
Yeah.
You're talking about deplatforming, and I've said this before, people like Peter Tatchell.
Yeah.
Somebody says that Peter Tatchell is a sexist because he says something they don't like, which is patent bloody nonsense.
Yeah, I know.
This guy's campaigned for gay rights and LGBT rights virtually his entire life.
Yeah, yeah.
So for some windbag to turn around and say they're not going to be on a stage with him and that he has to be withdrawn from the platform before they will speak is ludicrous.
It is ludicrous. You're seeing it with people like Jordan Peterson, where he's been shut down because people don't like his views. But in a lot of the cases with people like him, he's being misrepresented anyway, and his views aren't what That's the problem. You see, you've also got issues where what Christopher Hitchens said is right. Public opinion is the biggest threat, but you've got this problem especially on social media, where you get these people who claim to speak for a whole community, and they don't. They're speaking for themselves. You can't speak for a start with. How do you define like a whole community of people that you're pretending to speak for in the first place? It's like it's a very, it's a big sort of soup at the moment. This issue of free speech, and it's becoming increasingly cloudy. And I think really, we need some clarity, but we don't need any more erosion of free speech, because governments will do anything they can to erode it. So we don't
Absolutely,
and we don't want public opinion, sort of contributing towards that as well.
Well, it's crazy. I mean, you take it to its ultimate, conclusion, and you see what was happening a few years ago, where you had the popular press in the UK were running stories about people being paedophiles.
Yeah, that's right.
And you ended up with a situation where a paediatrician, I think it was, in Wales, had their house stoned.
It was actually in Portsmouth.
Was it Portsmouth?
Yeah, there was that area of Portsmouth called Paulsgrove. It's notorious. It's quite near where I live, or reasonably near. And yeah, he was wrongly accused of being a paedophile, and he was actually a paediatrician.
Yeah. So basically, public opinion bands together, and you get the kind of limit that happens when you get groups of people banding together. Their intellect seems to run out their ear holes.
I don't think they had much to begin with in the case.
Well, anyone who can't, reads paediatrician and can't differentiate between that and somebody who has got, well, I'm not going to go into details, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
If they're doing that and they're going after people over something like that, then you're in trouble. And we get this all the time, and it's happening, coming kind of back on subject, if you like, to some degree with gaming.
Yeah.
You're finding it increasingly in gaming as well, where you get these groups where people seem to band into a group, and then they identify with that group, and it's the identity politics thing. And anybody who is outside of that group is kind of seen as the enemy.
Yeah, that's the problem, isn't it? It's this sort of kind of, it's so polarized, or it's become so polarized that there's not, they're not able to meet in the middle. It's like the views have to be at the extremes, and why is that the case? Is it because there's an increase in intolerance, perhaps?
It's weird. It's almost like and this kind of touches on what happened on the Discord yesterday, day before, whenever it was, where I find that often people are not necessarily arguing with what you're saying. They're arguing with some idea of what they think you're saying.
Yeah.
And so they don't actually engage at all with what you've actually said.
That happens so much online. It's just straw man, isn't it? It's just basically, they're trying to put the argument onto what they want it to be about, not what it actually is. And I think that's...
But not only that, it's the argument, they want to put forward the argument that they want to argue with.
Yes. That's a good way of putting it, actually. Yeah.
They want an argument.
Yeah.
They're looking for an argument.
Yeah.
So they make you into that figure that they want to argue with, and then they come after you with everything they've got, and it's impossible to engage with them when they do that. It just becomes
absolutely
an utterly pointless exercise.
Yeah, it's a waste of time and energy, because it's never going to resolve itself. Because it's the whole idea is that the other person wants to perpetuate it forever. It's like, whoa, no.
And that really that is, when it becomes a real problem for me in this instance, but for anybody who is pretty much, well, I mean, I would describe myself as a kind of free speech absolutist. I think that everybody should have the right to speak, no matter what they're saying.
Yeah.
And if I get offended by it, that's on me.
Yeah. Precisely.
And I'm entitled to be offended by it. What I'm not entitled to do is stop them saying it.
Yeah.
I can argue with them. I can engage with them. But when it becomes a problem when you're trying to engage with people who simply won't engage.
Yeah, and then they make it about personal attacks, which kind of like completely sort of makes their own argument irrelevant, because they've taken it out of discourse and made it something entirely provocative.
Yeah, and you see it with very at the risk of alienating another group. You see it with certain, not all of them, the majority I would say not, but you see it within certain parts of third wave feminism. There's some people in that group who will not engage and will not will not take on board the idea that they may think I'm wrong, and that's fine. If somebody thinks I'm wrong, that's fine.
Yeah.
Tell me why I'm wrong. Engage with me. I'm not an unreasonable person. Engage with me. Tell me why you think I'm wrong. And we can have a conversation at night. And you know what? I might change my view.
Yeah, I said that to someone on social media the other day. They said, "Oh, I disagree with your view on this game." I said, "Good." I said, "I'm glad, because I'm not arrogant enough to think that just because I have an opinion or a preference or a taste on something that is an absolute thing, And
when you're talking about art, then it absolutely
it's subjective, isn't it? It's like, and he said why he thought, from his perspective, it was wrong. I said, yeah, that's fair enough. I agree. I think you've got every right to say that, and what you're saying makes sense. But what we're seeing is there's less and less of that going on, because if you create a culture where it's seen as okay to be kind of this, to take this extreme kind of position against someone's views that you don't agree with, you sort of normalise it. It becomes then part of the culture, and then that's all that happens from that point onwards. That's kind of like the accepted process of going about things. So you don't get proper discourse, do you? You just get these extreme points of view clashing against each other. Absolutely.
And I would take this even further. I agree with I think Sam Harris said something about this, and Sam Harris says, and I don't agree with everything Sam Harris says, and there's many times I've disagreed with him, but his views on this I think are spot on. He says that civilization advances through a series of successful conversations. And the flip side of that is, in my view, and I don't know if he's actually said this, but I would say that I think society falls if we stop talking.
Yeah.
I think that our society is absolutely predicated on the ability to interact with each other and to understand that somebody else's viewpoint is just as valid as yours, and listening is just as important as speaking.
Well, communication is key. It's such an important part of our society, our culture, our history. It's like, we're changing the way we communicate, and we have done in the last 20 or 30 years because of the internet, and it's fundamentally changed both how we communicate and the quality of our communication. And I think that's key. What Sam Harris said is correct. That is how civilization advances, but we don't want to regress, because we've become so used to the convenient methods of communication through social media, for instance, that what happens is the actual content of what we're saying gets lost in translation or gets eroded by these kind of outside forces that we've just been talking about, that have an agenda to kind of like promote this sort of lack of tolerance and extremism. I think Sam Harris is big on that. I know that from
absolutely,
just listening to him and various podcasts, and so it's an interesting subject, but it's kind of one that I really hope doesn't go the way I'm seeing it at the moment, because the Simon Chalinsky thing is like a drop in the ocean, I think.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think, you mentioned Jordan Peterson earlier on as well. And while I quite often find myself disagreeing with him, certainly on areas of religion and stuff like that.
I found it. I listen to a lot of what he says, and I like some of it, but I have in recent weeks thought, no, I don't agree with that at all. But that's good, because it means I'm getting these opposing views, But
that's the whole point, isn't it? That this is what, it goes back to what I said earlier about, identity politics. I can agree with Jordan Peterson on one issue and disagree with him vehemently on another. Yeah. It's like, Christopher Hitchens, I admired Christopher Hitchens a lot, but I vehemently disagreed with him on Iraq. I could understand where he was coming from.
Absolutely.
But I disagreed with him on it.
Yeah.
and we need to be able to. And we're kind of going over the same ground again, but this really worries me that people don't seem to be able to understand that it's not this one size fits all homogenous thing, whereby, that guy over there said something I agree with once, so I'm going to agree with everything he says from now on.
Yes, exactly. It's like...
and the flip side of that is that guy said something I disagreed with once. So, never mind the fact that guy might be saying something that's actually, beneficial to everybody, or is beneficial to you personally, or might enlighten you in some way. No, you've shut it down. You're not going to listen anymore because he once said something you don't agree with. And it's crazy. When I say the word crazy, I mean that literally.
Yeah.
It literally is, on some level, psychotic.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is. And I think you mentioned it a couple of weeks ago. We've got to make sure that we don't lose the ability to think critically and to question things. Because if you're raising a generation like, say the current sort of millennial generation, where you're teaching them not to question things or not to think critically, then all you'll end up with is what you've just said. You'll end up with an homogenous culture that's bland and doesn't query anything. And I don't want to be in that situation.
No, I don't want to live in that society. No. I'd rather be in a society where, I don't want people shouting in my face, but I'd rather be in a society where people are prepared to argue but put forward their arguments in a reasonable way and try and understand, because there are processes you can learn. There are ways of going about discourse that you can learn.
You can learn them, absolutely.
And they seem to be those. Maybe we're just two old codgers or something, but those kind of ideas, those ways of going about things, which have existed, they're part of the whole Enlightenment process. The whole idea of the Enlightenment, and this idea of free speech came about from that, and the understanding that you can't have a free society without free speech, and you can't have art without free speech and freedom of expression. It just doesn't exist. If you close those down, if you look at totalitarian regimes, their art's shit.
It's terrible. Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen some communist art. I think it's interesting because Jordan Peters actually collects communist art from Soviet Russia. For some reason, he's fascinated with it, but it's exactly that point. Though you don't get any variety because you're not allowed to express yourself freely within that society. So all you're going to get are representations of, say, the government or whatever they want you to paint, in order to create an image that reflects their views, and it's kind of like this one view only.
Or you end up with the situation like in medieval with medieval poetry, and I think I mentioned this. I'm getting very esoteric now, where you end up with a situation where the secular poetry simply doesn't exist for the most part.
No.
Because it was literally destroyed, which is what you're getting now with ISIS.
Yeah.
Where they're literally destroying and breaking anything that doesn't fit with their worldview. And that is where you will end up. Without free speech, that's what, and I know this seems like some people are going to be, if they've got this far, some people are going to be listening to this and say, oh, that's a bit far, he's getting a bit far-fetched with that. But no, it's not.
No, it's
that's
not.
Where it ends up.
No, that is the logical end point. Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, free speech.
Yeah.
Embrace it.
On.
But just one last aside. That's why these things worry me. Why when you're running something like a Discord channel, on some tiny level, you have responsibility, and you have to rack your brains about things like that, about stopping people from talking.
Yeah.
And sometimes, yes, sometimes, as evidenced this week, sometimes it is necessary. But you cannot... and like I say, it's a tiny little Discord, and most people couldn't care less about it. But from my perspective, from me, that's something that is core to who I am, the idea of free speech and allowing other people to say things you don't agree with.
Yeah.
So it should never ever be something you do lightly. Is to stop people's voice.
No, you're right.
People
and
down.
I realised that as well when I sort of witnessed the whole process from an outside perspective. Because you're right. If you support free speech, then you're going to let. It's natural that you're going to want someone to try. To I don't know, almost comply with the basic rules of the Discord. But when it became clear that this particular person didn't want to, it's like, well, there's not much more you can do, is there? Because you've given them the opportunity to, and if they don't want to engage, then there you go.
It's like discourse again. It comes back to discourse. We want a discourse, not a monologue.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah, we do.
Right, and on that note, I suppose we better finish. God, we've been going on for an hour and 40 minutes, and for anyone who's got this far, we were actually talking for about 40 minutes before we even started. So
yes, we certainly covered a lot of ground there, didn't we? Yeah.
So what I'll do is, if you can just tell people about your channel one last time, as I always do with this, and I'll put a link in, obviously, but just tell people one last thing about your channel, where they can find you, and then I'll sign off.
Yeah, I mean, you can find me on YouTube. I think it's youtube.com. I'm going to get this right. youtube.com/C, like lowercase c, /overtheedge. And the O, the T, and the E from like over the and edge are capital. But also, you can find me on Twitter at OvertheEdge YT. So that's my Twitter handle. OvertheEdge YT. That's me.
And as I say, I will put a link in. And as a bit of a shameless plug for myself here, Grant is also always on, well, not always, but quite often on my Discord. So if you like a good chat and you're prepared to engage and are prepared to put your opinion but listen to other people, then come along and have a chat with us and the other people on there, because we will talk about virtually anything. Yeah. As you've probably guessed from listening to this.
Small friendly Discord, and there's some good people on there.
Absolutely. And I think that's us done. So I will say bye, and I will speak to you again soon, Grant, and I will speak to you guys in the next one. Bye.
Bye.